Feeling somewhat uneasy, Vorax hastened through the hallway checkpoints as swiftly as the new security protocols permitted. Ostensibly, they were there to scan for spy drones, microscopic or otherwise, but everyone knew it was simply an attempt to subtly impose a more military mindset on the Senate. Even with its purpose so transparent, it was nonetheless effective, as the presence of weapons on the guards was a stark contrast to the notion of peace the Senate was meant to embody. Damn Lonix, Vorax thought, as he made his way through the entrance doors and down the aisle to the main dais. The Lonix were the native high-sentient species and hosts of the unified Galactic Senate. They, along with the Heptos and Nix, were the original founders of the Senate and undoubtedly wielded the most political influence. It had been a push by Lazinx, first among the 3 Lenix senators, even the Nix only had 2 representatives, to install the security stations and, it being a point of relatively minor dispute, none had felt the need to directly oppose him except the Eighth Arm Bloc, who were notorious for basing almost all their decisions on opposing the Lanik. The assembly had taken their seats by the time Vorax reached the dais. Lazial, another Lanik senator, hurriedly quieted the congregation and began his introduction. Now, as you all are aware, there has been much discussion over the recent United Response Bill, dubbed the Warmonger Bill by its critics. Vorax could see Lazinx's grimace. The fact that Lazial had even mentioned the nickname indicated that the Lenix were divided on this issue. Though Lazial had nowhere near the influence Lazinx had, this was somewhat offset by the Lenix nomenclature and the inability of some species to distinguish between the different Lenix senators at all. With the passing of the bill after the wise amendment from the Lumos representative, again Lazinx allowed his displeasure to show, though the Lenix were known for their stoic manner. We now come to the inquiry and evaluation, said amendment required. Allow me to introduce Physician Vorax of the Interstellar Emissaries. Vorax walked up onto the stage, though he noticed that while Lazial had acknowledged his expertise and position aboard a very prestigious galactic peace organization, the speaker had neglected to mention his home planet. Such a thing would have been customary, and Vorax suspected the omission was intentional, reflecting the Lenik dislike of Vorax's species, the Cretonia. The Lenik had risen to prominence on the Council as one of the 3 founding species due to their technological prowess. They had developed on an interconnected world and, through extensive experimentation and exploration, managed to journey to a nearby star system. They had selected this system because their optical instruments had indicated the potential presence of habitable planets. Anticipating basic life forms, they were utterly astonished to discover not 1, but 2 highly intelligent species, the Nix and the Heptos, though neither had achieved space travel. By offering their most rudimentary technology, the Lenik established an alliance with themselves at the helm, thus initiating the path to the Senate. Vorax and the Cretonia were also a highly scientific culture, and as the Lenik disliked rivals, the 2 species often had a strained relationship. Vorax suspected he was chosen to lead the inquiry for precisely this reason, with the Senate wanting a species not easily swayed or influenced by the Lenik. Physician Vorax has been at the forefront of numerous major interactions with the species in question, engaging in dialogue, exchanging information, and, under close Senate oversight and approval, technology. He is among the most experienced in the field and has been granted Senate resources to conduct a thorough investigation. Here at last is the most comprehensive and authoritative report on humans. Physician Vorax approached the podium and, after connecting his personal device to the Senate chamber system, began his presentation on the humans. The United Response Bill required me to conduct an extensive study of humans in their entirety, focusing on threat level and potential responses to recent events. Regrettably, as so little is known about this new species, having evolved on the very outskirts of our galaxy, this presentation may be lengthy, as there is a vast amount of information that must be understood before you can form an informed opinion. Vorax paused and surveyed his audience. There was much in his opening that he expected would be poorly received by various members of the Senate, and he was not disappointed. The Eighth Arm had collectively sighed and reclined as he mentioned the duration of the presentation, while the others had correctly interpreted Vorax's final sentence as a subtle criticism of Senate decisions and their prioritization of financial motives over information. Perhaps not the most prudent move on Vorax's part, but he was weary of Senate politics, of which he was often the target while serving with the interstellar emissaries. To start with, Vorax went on, the humans are a highly divided species, with numerous factions operating independently and at times in direct conflict with one another. To emphasize this point, this is quite unlike the Fabi and their opposing governmental systems. They engage in warfare against each other. Vorax allowed that point to settle for a moment. Some senators showed surprise while others were dismissive. More animated, he spoke with increased volume. Millions of humans at war for years, with one another. Now he had captured their attention, though Vorax realized the implications were not yet fully grasped by them. The chamber maintained proper decorum, but the facial expressions he could interpret displayed unease. Such wars occurred infrequently between different species, and only once before had anyone heard of an intra-species conflict of this magnitude. It had marked the beginning of the Heptos's downfall. How could a species constantly war internally to such an extent, yet still persist as the humans had? This fact has numerous implications, but foremost among them is that it is here that the foundation of the warmonger bill becomes apparent. The attacks on Senate ships were not, as has been suggested, the work of humanity as a whole, but a minuscule profiteering segment of them who act in direct opposition to the main government. As anticipated, even the most composed senators erupted into an uproar, quite literally in the case of the avian Avius, at this disclosure, though Vorax noticed none of the Lunix so much as flinched. They had been aware of this. There was no way they didn't expect Vorax to uncover it, so he deduced they clearly had an internal agenda of which none of the other senators were aware. Lae'zel calmly rose and gestured for silence. He spoke over the most persistent of interrupters, the Eighth Arm in particular. Let us all restrain ourselves for a moment and hear the physician's further elaboration on the humans and the many potential risks they pose. He sat, leaving Vorax somewhat perplexed. Hadn't Lae'zel been an opponent of the bill? He had given the report an air of threat assessment rather than a species analysis. Perhaps his initial introduction had been a political maneuver. Regrettably, threat assessment was what Vorax had concentrated on, as one could scarcely see anything else when examining humans. He proceeded, bringing up a small 3D rotating version of Terra on the Senate hologram system. This is the human homeworld, called Earth in their main language, of which you should note is one of many widely used and accepted languages of the species. It has been designated Terra for simplification purposes. Foremost among all facts of the world, as you almost certainly know, Terra is a death world, and humans a rare death world, high sentient species. Many senators exchanged looks and murmurs. A death world was a world of predator and prey, with a vast ecosystem of microscopic diseases and deadly biologicals. Death world high sentients were exceedingly rare. Humans were the third ever found, and now one of only two still existing. Nearly all of the Council evolved on interdependent planets, with only the xenophilia, known as Xeno, originating from a death world. Vorax noticed their representative didn't seem too pleased with the confirmation that they were no longer top of the food chain. Vorax disliked that term, but felt the humor worth it and had a small internal chuckle. The 3D image of Terra had distance and density measurements, showing it to have almost twice the gravity of the Xeno homeworld, suggesting that the humans would outperform the Xeno in a primal setting. Given the Senate's internal focus, we managed to overlook this outer system of high sentience as they mastered intra- and inter-system travel and even terraforming. Now, even as I deliver this presentation, the humans are in the third year of the terraforming of their 16th planet. This fact was not an issue in itself, as there were many species which had that and more, but that the humans had done so outside Senate notice was a significant failing. The Senate had reduced exploration measures by extremes in a move to fund habitable space stations, a move widely viewed as executed by corrupt senators and production lobbyists. Many senators seemed to sink a little into their seats, which was somewhat amusing in the case of the enormous Jorgath. Others, however, grew irritated. Vorax reminded himself to stop provoking them, as he needed this report to be taken seriously. As Vorax transitioned to a 2D slide depicting the main human political power centers and their relationships, Lazinx rose to his feet. Vorax paused, slightly thrown by the action. Lazinx seldom spoke in the Senate, typically relying on one of the other two Linux senators to express his views. "If I may," he spoke softly, but with the characteristic puff at the end of certain syllables in the galactic tongue. It wasn't a species-specific issue, as Lazial could speak flawlessly. "I would like to summarize what you have discussed up to this point." Vorax considered his presentation thus far and replied, "I would prefer to be allowed to finish, as context is quite relevant for the many aspects of humanity." "Yes, I concur entirely," responded Lazinx, "and it's just that there have been a few interruptions, and I'd like to recap what you've said so far, so that everyone may grasp what you will say going forward. I'd be glad to have you correct me if I've misunderstood any of your points." Vorax hesitated, sensing a potential trap, but nodded. "Humanity, as you indicated, is a high-gravity, death-world high sentient. They are divided and unpredictable in many ways, while perpetually at war. Having used fusion bombs on their own people, no one truly knows what they are capable of or how far they will go." Vorax felt all his muscles tighten simultaneously. He had not mentioned the fusion bombs. Lazinx had conducted his own research, and Vorax was beginning to understand why. They are a highly expansionary force, spreading from their home system like an exothermic reaction in dry brush, bringing with them their conflict and war, as evidenced by the attack on Senate ships. Moreover, if this was a separate group, it only demonstrates how little control their own governing body has over the chaos that is their people. "Now wait a moment," Vorax spoke loudly, causing Lazinx to start and give him a look of bewilderment, both of which Vorax knew to be feigned. "You are mischaracterizing them." "Am I?" asked Lazinx. "Is anything I said inaccurate?" "Well, not exactly," Vorax stammered, causing that Lonik to once again display an expression. Amusement, though since he was facing away from the crowd, only Vorax could see it. "Damn, damn, damn, damn," Vorax thought to himself, as murmurs began throughout the Senate. He possessed nowhere near the political savvy of Lazinx, and now he understood what the Lanik was after. He had been certain his revelation of the attacks being the actions of a rogue would be enough to sway the Senate away from aggression towards the humans, demonstrating that they were not all responsible for the attack and not all deserving of punishment. Lazinx had altered their minds. It was no longer a matter of punishment, it was a question of survival. He had made the senators ask themselves one question: was humanity too dangerous to allow to exist? Physician Vorax took a deep breath to steady himself, forgetting the atmosphere of the Senate chamber was not an ideal composition for him. The Lanik had developed a gas mixture that allowed for almost all Senate species to breathe without apparatus, but in accommodating so many, it had left the air relatively uncomfortable for nearly all. Ironically, this had led to a few senators bringing in personal breathing tanks for comfort until a Senate bill prohibited them unless absolutely necessary. The senators were difficult to understand, and as Vorax knew, the Eighth Arm Bloc had used the tanks as an excuse to disrupt the proceedings. His presentation on the humans had gotten away from him. In hindsight, he should have anticipated how information on the humans would be interpreted by the Senate. He had personally had the same initial reaction to humanity and their chaotic nature. The Senator Lazinx was still standing, not satisfied, it seemed, with the reaction he had elicited in his brief speech on the danger humanity represented. He took a quick glance at the slide Vorax currently had on display, and once the murmurs had subsided, began to speak again. "Perhaps, physician, you might focus your presentation on the threat the humans may pose, as that is most likely to be the deciding factor in the Senate decision. Perhaps you could move ahead to more pertinent information." Vorax stared at him, though he wasn't certain it was noticed. Kryptonian expressions are primarily communicated through speech patterns, and a scolding tone would be extremely impolite in the Senate chamber. He had been instructed by his representative to maintain one of the various formal tones. Nevertheless, Vorax seized the chance to chastise the senator through his words. "While I imagine the esteemed Lanik senator has conducted a thorough study of warfare and its numerous aspects, war being a most serious matter, and one which the senator would require the utmost comprehension, it is still essential in assessing a threat to grasp all the components of the whole, so that one might accurately determine how a species may respond. Vorax felt a slight satisfaction seeing Lazinx's expression shift to a frown. He observed, however, that both the High Admiral of the Great Fleet and the Xeno representative nodded in agreement. It is for this reason I will proceed in describing the current political structure of the humans and how it influences their organization. The primary political entity governing humanity is the well-known Federated Realms of Sapience, the structure of which they have openly shared. Vorax was aware that the structural information the human government had provided had somewhat downplayed the military, depicting it as a minor escort and policing force. What remains unknown is its history. Humanity, even when it first began inter-system travel, had no central planetary government, with numerous factions competing for control. It was only when their first planetary colony was established that an alliance of two major faction powers was formed, and the initial step towards species unification began. It was, in a manner I believe the Senate would appreciate, a rather astute political move. Humans, when they began to consider that another colony might be beyond any planetary control, were persuaded that a main planetary government would enable better oversight. That was the inception of the FRS, and now they are the primary authority behind 12 worlds, and very soon a 13th. He paused, aware that, while a few senators already knew what he would discuss next, the rest had noticed the discrepancy between humanity's supposed 16 planets mentioned earlier in the presentation and the 13 just cited. He anticipated Lazinx would again question him on the matter, but the Lanik remained seated, likely realizing that Vorax would have to explain regardless. At present, there exist two human planets, known as Odin and Freya, which have formed an alliance and stand in opposition to the FRS. As a result, humanity finds itself embroiled in a civil war. This statement, as expected, triggered a flurry of side discussions and general unrest within the Senate. Vorax observed that even the Eighth Arm had begun to pay close attention to him. Lazial rose once more to calm the assembly and again started speaking before the last of the interruptions had subsided. Here we see evidence of humanity's fractured state, as you've previously mentioned, but what is the current situation of the remaining human planet? He directed his question towards Vorax as he spoke and sat down upon finishing. So they are aware of that. The planet now known as Novakos is no longer inhabitable. A hush fell over the Senate, though Lazinx quickly jumped to his feet, as if jolted from his seat. "How can such a thing be possible?" he exclaimed. "Was it some massive collision event?" Vorax sighed, once again forgetting about the air issues. "No, the evidence collected indicates that human action was responsible for the planet's destruction." And chaos erupted. The only comparable event was the genetically engineered disease of the Heptos, which had been successfully contained, but was recorded in history as the most heinous war crime ever committed. Aside from conspiracy theories propagated against the Senate, of course. Lazinx shouted above the uproar, "They are insane to cause such devastation, to sacrifice an asset for no reason other than to hinder the opponent." "You are mistaken," Vorax responded. "The humans reported that an unknown and lethal pathogen had completely infected the colony, and that they had destroyed it to ensure their species' survival." "But many humans believe this to be a lie," retorted Lazinx. "Many think it's merely a cover to demonstrate government power." How had the Lanik obtained such information? Had he managed to access the interplanetary information network of the humans? Vorax himself had established just such an array after considerable investment of both time and Senate resources. "As the Senate is clearly of one mind on this matter," Vorax stated, effectively dismissing Lazinx from further input, "I will now proceed to discuss humanity's strengths and weaknesses in both technological and biological domains." This section of the presentation was originally meant to emphasize a decision already reached, but now, given the Senate's new perspective, Vorax realized it was crucial to convey the significance of this area. The fact was, Vorax held no particular protectiveness towards humans. They were a fascinating species, possessing a vast array of technology and knowledge. Their behaviors would take a lifetime to comprehend, and Vorax wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to accurately anticipate their future actions. The Senate races would likely benefit from ongoing trade relations with humanity. Despite all this, None of it was why Vorax was attempting to prevent a war. The new emphasis on humanity as a threat would not be countered. There was simply too much evidence supporting it, and with the Lanex so determined to have it viewed as such, Vorax could never have prevented it. It was now time for a new approach to avert the war. It was time for physician Vorax to persuade the Senate of what he already knew, that there was a strong possibility the Senate would lose the war. Prologue, Part 1. Part 2. Happy these are being well received. I've noticed my personal tendency to over-extrapolate is emerging in these stories. I'll probably continue with that, as it's enjoyable. P. Let us commence with an overview of human evolutionary biology. Physician Vorax began, navigating through his slides and hollows to a detailed 3D image of the human male and female forms. Humans are a typical anisogamous reproductive life form, with a gestation period of 9 months within the human female. Full development of the human body is generally achieved about 17 years after birth. This was a relatively brief growth period, but given the human's death world origin, Vorax had expected half that. The Xeno reached full growth only 7 years after conception. The average lifespan of a human is approximately 120 years with proper care, though deterioration of the body typically begins after roughly 105 years of life. The difference between the two gender varieties is minimal, with the only major distinctions being reproductive organs and hormone balances. It was time for Vorax to delve into the more perilous topics. The hormone levels in both sexes, however, are immense compared to other life forms. Serving as a catalyst for physical development, the simple variation in hormone levels results in a notable average difference in physical strength between the genders. This elicited a few surprised reactions, though the Xeno barely showed a facial response. Perhaps this biological phenomenon was a common trait of death worlds, although Aeon knew the Xeno had more typical levels. There is, however, a particular hormone of note present in certain evolutionary lineages of Terra, including humans. The human body contains a gland that produces epinephrine. Even the Xeno's eyes widened at that. Once again, the Senate erupted in commotion, and Vorax lamented to himself that he was never going to get through a point without interruption. He had spoken in front of protests that had shouted over him less. Epinephrine was considered a highly potent and dangerous stimulant throughout the Senate worlds. Only one known planet produced it naturally, and the Nyx claim to it had allowed them to maintain one of the wealthiest economies in the galaxy. The hormone had been part of many evolutionary branches on a death world, no high sentience on this one, and was currently a point of much debate in the Senate. Artificially synthesized epinephrine had been classified as an illegal substance, as its use led to violent, uncontrollable aggression and sometimes death. But a loophole that the Nyx had exploited was that a separate bill had declared no substance produced through natural, internal sentient biology could be considered illegal. Otherwise, discrimination against certain species would be widespread throughout the Senate worlds. As many beings on this death world were classified as sentient, the Nyx were able to extract the epinephrine from them and sell it legally. This is where, of course, the environmentalists came in. Extracting the hormone would often cause permanent harm to the being, and protesters were beginning to act more forcefully of late, storming extraction facilities and halting all production. Vorax personally couldn't comprehend how the protesters could bear putting their backs to a death world species, properly segregated or not, but they insisted the Nyx were cruel and must be stopped. The Nyx, in response, had begun military expansion in order to properly secure their planet. No one had fired a shot as of yet, but it had been close a few times. The Nyx had managed to keep their planet from interference recently, but there currently was a strong push on the senators to outlaw the extraction practice. The fact that humans have evolved with this hormone naturally implies that they are much more adept at efficiently utilizing its effects. A study of the evolutionary chains on planet Zeta-9, made public by the Nyx, indicates that natural epinephrine consumption enhances the host's innate abilities, without the harmful side effects an unnatural user would face. The creatures still experience elevated aggression, but never death or damaged body parts, such as torn muscles or tendons. They also seem to maintain a sense of self-preservation. Its impact on a highly sentient species remains somewhat speculative, and most of our knowledge is derived secondarily from publicly released human information. This was the weak section of Vorax's report. The Nix analysis bore the hallmarks of political vetting throughout, and Vorax lacked access to the raw data. The human network was a valuable resource, but so vast and heavily censored that finding the relevant information was nearly impossible. Humans, it has been discovered, often employ epinephrine as a medical tool. They frequently use it to maintain a human's heart, the blood-circulating muscle, beating at a life-sustaining rate when circumstances might otherwise prevent it. Noticing a frown on the High Admiral's face, Vorax moved on to the more relevant area, though he knew it would be woefully inadequate. While humans recognize an effect of epinephrine in high-stress situations, the extent to which it influences their bodily functions or rational thinking is unknown. Vorax felt the nervousness return as the Senate seemed to collectively glare at him. Analyzing the humans within the given time frame had been an almost impossible task, and now they were faulting him for incomplete information. His fear quickly subsided, and he grew angry once more. Nevertheless, he continued, the consensus among many independent hormone experts is that with the epinephrine gland of humans being somewhat smaller than those of Zeta-9 species, humanity likely uses far less of the hormone, and thus its combat enhancement would be minimal. Further evidence for this lies in the simple fact that humanity is a highly sentient species. How could they properly maintain such a position if the hormone was potent enough to impair their judgment? Many senators appeared satisfied by this, though Vorax noticed the High Admiral still seemed far from content. It was time to progress to the centerpiece of Vorax's report. He switched the display from the two human genders to an enlarged, see-through 3D image of the human male. This image showed all the internal workings of the human. By activating certain controls, he could emphasize areas of the human internal systems. It had likely been the most nerve-wracking experience of Vorax's life when he, 5 public envoy associates, and 3 students had navigated a small, unarmed vessel into the human conflict zone. There had initially been the hope of going undetected, but naturally the humans tracked them. Vorax had devised a backup plan for such a scenario, and by notifying the humans of the interstellar emissaries' vital purpose statement, and that they were a galactically recognized peace and welfare group, they were permitted entry onto the disputed world to provide aid to injured non-combatants. Vorax felt quite certain that if their ship had contained even a mildly threatening object, however, they would have been reduced to mere debris. The students had voiced surprise at being allowed on the human planet Freya, as humans were typically very strict about entry into their habitats, demanding extensive tests and checks to ensure a visitor carried nothing harmful to planet ecosystems. Vorax considered it a reasonable precaution, if perhaps slightly excessive, though he knew some accused the humans of being xenophobic. Vorax had correctly anticipated that a war zone would waive said precautions in light of more pressing threats, and so his team descended to the surface to assist injured humans. Their lack of familiarity with human biology had limited them to mere assistance. Sometimes not even that, as human surgeons preferred working with assistants they knew better and who could respond quicker. Nevertheless, they obtained what they were after during the very first shift, and citing exhaustion, swiftly returned to Senate territory with promises of requesting further aid. Fortunately, they were never in the vicinity of a contested area and thus avoided most of the risk. The mission had been crucial and had required meticulous planning, but the fear had always been present. Thankfully, though, it was fruitful. They had secured a human corpse. Through meticulous autopsy, comprehensive examination, and ongoing consultation with the human network, Vorax had managed to assemble a complete model of human bodily functions. Certain specifics like brain activity, nervous system interaction, and muscle contraction, aspects one couldn't glean from a deceased body, were naturally beyond his grasp, but he had a basic understanding of fundamental processes. As the 3D image rotated before the Senate, Vorax explained, "A death world environment accelerates evolution dramatically. Thus, humans, as the apex predator of a vast number of species, are simply those which evolve the fastest from more primitive forms. This rapid evolution has produced remarkable features, such as the epinephrine gland or their bipedal center of balance. Typically, bipeds were easily unbalanced, but humans had demonstrated astonishing dexterity. It had been one of the primary news stories following initial contact. It has also, as such an accelerated evolution inevitably does, created a few vulnerabilities. The High Admiral's head jerked out of his contemplation and focused on Vorax, even as several senators appeared to relax slightly in their previously concerned expressions. Vorax had a small, internal, humorless laugh. They were latching onto these supposed weaknesses, not realizing that compared to the human as a whole, the vulnerabilities were nearly impossible to exploit. Very well, let us begin with the ankle. Physician Vorax activated a sequence on his data device, highlighting on the 3D human image a certain protruding area on the lower part of the human leg, just above the foot. As he emphasized the bone structure, he silently marveled at the duration that had passed without a major interruption. The Lennox seemed satisfied that the tone of the presentation had been set to their liking, and the rest of the Senate appeared to be highly focused on the content, though he had noticed the 8th arm block had resumed their lethargic posture. The human endoskeleton is of a typical composition for a vertebrate, albeit much denser than average, as expected of a ground-based death world species. Their rapid evolutionary pace, however, has left certain bone connections in a less than ideal position. This is most evident in the human ankle, joining their foot to their leg. The foot can only rotate vertically, somewhat limiting maneuverability. Due to human muscle and bone density, this might hardly be considered a weakness, but often it is the human itself who would injure that ankle by placing its entire body weight on a precariously positioned foot. This forces the ankle from its socket. A simple application of this is that humans struggle with traversing uneven terrain, often needing to move cautiously to prevent ankle bones from breaking or dislocating. A study of evolutionary paths on Terra has revealed that this structure originates from a previous being that used foot claws to attack, and generations later utilized the feet as a tool manipulator. Above all, though, it should be noted that while the lack of maneuverability is a weakness, the trade-off is that the force a human can generate through their foot is immense. By balancing on one foot, a few senators shook their heads at that, but too many videos had been broadcast to truly disbelieve it was just so peculiar. It has been theorized that a human could exert up to 4,500 newtons of force through a kick with the other foot. Many eyes widened at this. The Yorgoth, the most massive species in the Senate, was 4 times the size and 7 times the weight of a human, could exert a force of 14,000 newtons, though that was almost entirely generated by stepping on the target area and utilizing the size of the Jorgath foot and its weight. That humanity, so small in comparison, could produce such a force was disconcerting. Granted, power armor was a common tool among all species, but it could only enhance existing strengths, provide too much power, and you might damage the nervous system or simply overwhelm the physical body, having the armor move faster than tendons or bones could handle. Vorax noticed the High Admiral deep in thought, likely devising physical counters to the force a human could generate. He suspected they had their own power armor, amplifying already incredible strength. This ankle weakness is perhaps the most significant, but merely one of many shortcomings in human evolution. All, however, have some workaround or strength to compensate, as is typical of a death world species. Simple examples include their limited range of vision, offset by enhanced peripheral awareness, and the senses of hearing and smell working together to form a more complete picture. Or humanity's inability to match many prey species' speed, compensated for by endurance and persistence. The Terra rotational cycle spans 24 hours, and a human could remain physically active throughout the entire daylight period without noticeable side effects. And because I notice a few of you scoffing, I'll remind you that Terra has a gravitational pull of 9.2. The senators in question adopted slightly sheepish expressions. Most seemed to forget Vorax's profession and his ability to interpret their body language. Lazial seized this moment to interject, rising to address Vorax. On behalf of the entire Senate, I'd like to thank you for the time and effort you've clearly invested in this presentation, Physician Vorax. Now, while there's evidently an extensive portion dedicated to human biology, you've already outlined the key factors and, by your own admission, further expansion relates to less pertinent information. Perhaps we could shift from biology to humanity's technology, as this is clearly the most crucial factor in the current discussion. Vorax stood somewhat bewildered. He had barely begun his section on human biology. There were so many intricacies and details he had yet to delve into, so much still of the fascinating human biological structure to illustrate and explain. "Physician?" Lazial prompted when Vorax failed to respond. "Ah, yes, certainly." Vorax recognized that Lazial, while at odds with all Cretonians generally, wasn't being impolite in his request, just attempting to keep the presentation focused on essential content. The truth was, Vorax conceded to himself, he had likely placed too much emphasis on biology, as it was his personal field of study. He knew his family and even some colleagues considered him somewhat verbose, but he simply couldn't fathom how anyone could not find the human evolutionary path consequential. It was so captivating. Remembering to control his breath when the urge to sigh struck him again, he scrolled through the numerous slides and images he had prepared on biology and arrived at the relatively small section on technology. All that work to obtain a body, he mused to himself, nearly sighing once more. As many of you are aware, the humans are extremely protective of both their military and technological secrets. The bulk of this section is conjectural, with as much evidence as has been gathered in the entirety of Senate interaction with the humans. All diplomatic meetings with humanity have occurred planetside or aboard either our own vessels or human diplomatic ships. They have ensured that none of their military vessels have come into contact with Senate-loyal ships, explaining when questioned that they wish to demonstrate trust and build a mutually beneficial relationship. The more probable reason is that they simply do not want to reveal any combat information. A wise decision, it would appear. Even when he had made his expedition to Freya, the humans had contacted and guided him away from disputed areas long before he might have glimpsed the war parties. As I mentioned, all human ships observed are diplomatic and harmless, except this one. Vorax brought up a 3D image of the first vessel the Senate had ever encountered. This ship, the first ever seen of humanity, is clearly more than a simple transport. Because this encounter occurred before humans traded for and acquired scanner technology, a thorough scan was conducted, and a detailed analysis was compiled. It is, to this day, the best insight we have into the military arm of humanity. Almost all the senators, and certainly the High Admiral, displayed looks of distinct displeasure. Almost immediately following first contact, profit-seeking companies and individuals practically raced to trade with the humans. Human goods would sell for enormous premiums, simply due to their exotic origin. The Senate had swiftly regulated and essentially halted trade, but the damage had been done. Humans had obtained in that brief window a vast amount of technology most likely entirely new to them. To complicate matters further, the Senate gained little of their expertise, with most of the goods they traded being simple consumption items or small trinket works. The first diplomatic vessel of the humans after this flow of goods had a scan screen. They had, in such a short time, adopted new technology to the point where it defended against our own. Even ships outside FRS government control had scan screens installed, so there would be no easy look into human technology any longer. The scanned vessel possessed a massive hull, utilizing steel alloy as armor rather than a projection field. The armor, while seemingly rudimentary, would nonetheless prove highly effective against laser fire, as the hull is too thick for the beam to penetrate without sustained fire, and the engine exhaust targets are relatively small. A skilled weapons master coupled with a fortunate computer might be able to disable an engine, but there is a greater chance of success in simply employing plasma weapons and... Vorax stopped as the High Admiral abruptly stood and silenced him with a loud command. "Let us handle our strategy. You just provide the human ship details." He promptly sat back down, but maintained his unwavering gaze on Vorax. "Well, as I mentioned," Vorax continued, more intimidated by the High Admiral than the entire Senate combined, "the armor is approximately 4 meters thick and can easily deflect minor space debris impacts. There appeared to be various weapons aboard the ship, with a considerable amount of combustion explosives. The two other weapons were of greater concern, a fusion bomb and a cannon. The cannon is a massive electromagnetic projectile launcher. It is designed to fire an enormous block of depleted uranium. The concept is remarkably primitive, the high-tech equivalent of hurling a rock. However, the rock is so large and thrown so rapidly that it is somewhat questionable whether any but the most powerful shields could deflect it. The fusion bomb is of similar interest, as even though it clearly wouldn't be as effective outside the atmosphere and against shields, there are various spectrums in which such a device would assault a ship. Shields are quite effective at defending against heat, but Vorax glanced quickly at the High Admiral and proceeded, the electromagnetic and kinetic pulses would be of graver concern. Vorax paused briefly to collect his thoughts, and he considered how to properly inform the Senate of his next discovery. Many senators had begun private discussions in the short moment of silence. Combustion weapons were common, and though a fusion bomb was rare, such warfare had been encountered before. This projectile launcher, however, indicated that humans thought in a completely different manner than any of the Senate worlds. None had continued with projectile launching after blast and rocket technology had been refined. Humanity not only had persisted, but it seemed probable this simple weapon would be their most effective. Not all the faces were gloomy, though. Many were already aware of the human first contact vessel, as the analysis was fully accessible to any interested senator. Unsurprisingly, the Lanix senators seemed to have anticipated the announcement, and the High Admiral had likely reviewed the report numerous times. There is, however, Vorax spoke loudly, slightly shifting his speech style from formal, informative to formal, presenting, and talking over the other conversations. Something new my team has managed to ascertain about the human military. He had their attention once more. It began when a colleague posed what should have been an obvious question. Why would humans dispatch their first major diplomatic party without an escort? Did they truly wish to conceal their technology so desperately that they would endanger the lives of their most brilliant scientists and leaders? Vorax paused, surveying the Senate. He enjoyed speaking in this manner and was often accused of grandstanding in the interstellar emissaries. It felt fitting now, though. A thought then arose. What if the humans can conceal their ships from scanners? Can they block radar and pulse detection? The initial diplomatic meeting occurred on a Senate science vessel, which takes extensive readings of surrounding space and retains all recordings in storage. My team journeyed to the vessel. Upon examining those records, it was discovered that there were random heat signatures at various points present around the station during the time of the meeting. Vorax paused again, almost relishing the looks of gradual realization that appeared on the Senate. The High Admiral spoke softly, but with wide eyes. You mean? Yes, replied Vorax to the unfinished question. There is a strong possibility that humanity possesses ships capable of stealth. The implications were now dawning on all of the senators. Truly, humanity was not to be underestimated. You, the High Admiral spoke again. You absolute fool! He stood up and Vorax tensed slightly in fear. What? You absolute complete fool, he shouted. You mean that humans might have ships surrounding every core world of the Senate, and you are just informing us now? Perhaps it was Vorax who had failed to grasp the implications. Hello, everyone. I've returned. Here's the final installment of Dare We Fire. A different perspective this time. Please be sure to read the earlier parts before starting, though. Prologue. Part 1. Part 2. Part 3. Part 4. I don't care how many are running diagnostics. Get every vessel that can manage to launch into space out there. High Admiral Morelio yelled into his communicator. He was the only one permitted to bring a communicator into the Senate chambers. I need every blessed ship scanning every blessed summit of Senate space for unusual heat signatures, and tell them I need it done before every single one of their species is wiped from the blessed core by an enemy we can't even detect. Things had been taking a gradual turn for the worse for Morelio, ever since that blessed fool of a biologist took the stage. High-gravity death world inhabitants, natural adrenaline users, deities. This conflict the representatives seemed so excited about was shaping up to be an even worse tactical nightmare than the typical Senate-fueled dispute. Even before the arrogant specialist had stepped into the spotlight, Morelio had known the humans would not be an easy opponent. And then the fool had revealed the catastrophe. Stealth capabilities? How could it be? The Lennox military scientists had developed experimental pulse cloaks for use in crowded war zones. But radar stealth? Morelio was appalled at humanity's abilities. Deities, how long might the humans have been watching them? He spotted the public envoy physician trying to blend into the background of the dais, as the eruption of panic among the senators stripped all order from the proceedings. The High Admiral began to march directly towards him as he heard his fleet coordinator sound on his communicator. "I'm getting everything moving as quickly as possible. Quicker, according to some captains. But Admiral, what is the emergency? There is a chance the humans have, through stealth, taken up observational position in Senate core world space. Run every single counter-communication circuit we have and review every record between initial human contact and now. I need to know what they relayed to humanity's core. Go, now! I have more information to extract from a fool." Morelio strode up to Physician Vorax. He needed every little bit of information the questionably sentient being possessed. "Physician," the High Admiral exclaimed as the Cretonian shrank back, "is there anything else you might enlighten us with as we commence our desperate search for vessels we cannot detect?" "No, High Admiral," the physician maintained a remarkable composure. Morelio had witnessed combat officers stammer more in his presence while he was at his peak. "All we uncovered was what I mentioned, sporadic heat signatures, likely from engine firings, in locations where they shouldn't be. I can provide you with data on the specific readings, but no other revelations." "Do so. Send it to my reader. Here's the number. Forward your entire report as well, but in a separate file. I want to see your further elaboration on the biology." He turned to walk away, but a call from behind halted him. "High Admiral, I must apologize for my apparent oversight." Morelio felt a hint of surprise, though he showed none. It was rare to see a high scientist admit error, let alone apologize. "I should have recognized the implications of the discovery immediately, but was too engrossed in the academic study." The physician lowered his gaze to the floor, either from shame or embarrassment. Morelio couldn't tell, but the actions and words left an impression. "You're not military personnel, nor does your department participate in tactical decision-making. No one expects you to act as combat staff might. That said, your oversight could have led to the downfall of Senate supremacy. Continue your research into the humans, but I want regular updates sent. Is that clear?" The High Admiral fixed Vorax with his most intense stare. Surprisingly, it didn't have the desired effect. "High Admiral, I am under Senate commission to research and report on humans, providing information necessary for their formal evaluation." The physician spoke, still intimidated, but as one certain of his position. "They haven't declared formal war. Even your current defensive actions are likely bordering on illegal activity. I'll assist in any way I legally can, sir, but you're treading a fine line." Confounded regulations! The physician was correct, but there was no way Morelio would navigate the red tape required to obtain the reconnaissance he needed. "They won't begrudge me my ships in the air monitoring their exposed flanks, physician. As for formal war," he approached the podium, with the 3D image of the human warship still rotating in the air as a fitting backdrop. The High Admiral began to address the assembly. "In light of recent developments, I believe the Senate must swiftly and decisively move to a military footing." Morelio spoke over the numerous debates and side discussions taking place. His commanding voice, accustomed to authority and expecting compliance, quickly captured the senator's attention. "I petition the Senate to grant me the power to secure all Senate space and root out any potential espionage the humans might currently be conducting." All was quiet for a moment. High Admiral Morelio knew his proposal was too blunt and informal for the Senate, but he'd be damned by any and all gods before he took the time to draft a proper proposition form. The issue was that, even though he felt certain no one would criticize him for conducting reconnaissance, the actual firing upon a human vessel, spy or not, could be interpreted as an act of war. Were he to assume that authority, the Senate might have him arrested for attempting a military coup. He needed justification, even if it was just enough knotted agreements to a very informal speech, to do what he must to safeguard all the species of the Senate and not be condemned by that same Senate for his actions. Blast, but he despised the political constraints of high command. Li Zeng stepped forward with an expression Morelio couldn't quite read. The Measures of War Bill permits the granting of full authority to the High Admiral regarding all defensive actions to counter an aggressor species outside the Senate. I believe that is the current section you are referencing, High Admiral, is it not? Mirelio gazed at the Linux senator. He was not one to intimidate or surrender power easily. Why would Zinx assist him in this? Indeed, I feel that I require the authority to take actions and issue commands as swiftly as possible, and without the bureaucracy the Senate would create to address this crisis. All those in favor of proceeding with the Act of Measures of War, Section 2, entitled Defensive Authority? Zinx inquired loudly, employing an antiquated yet still valid voting method. Mirelio observed a multitude of appendages rise upward, a custom somewhat challenging for certain species. It seemed that, for once, enough of them grasped the peril. It only took the prospect that the senators themselves might be in immediate danger to spur them to action, Mirelio thought cynically. Very well, I shall commence. Mirelio was abruptly interrupted by Zinx. Now, as I'm certain you're aware, High Admiral, while this act grants you control over all spacecraft and reconnaissance, it still permits the entire Senate to hear crucial military communications up to and including the first shot fired. Both of Mirelio's primary eyes swelled. Military communication displayed publicly? This is, naturally, so that if it is the Senate forces who must initiate hostilities, all senators may have a vote in it. Subsequently, after any first shot occurrence, the Senate will have formally declared a state of war. Shouts of indignation erupted from the senators, cries that mirrored Mirelio's own rage. Zinx had made dupes of them all. The High Admiral was about to verbally eviscerate the Lenik when his communicator pulsed. His fleet coordinator began speaking in his ear. We've completed the survey of all communications archives, sir, and you'll be glad to know that... Mirelio lost focus on what he was saying as Latzail addressed him loudly. High Admiral, according to the act just put into effect, concealing any communication from Senate scrutiny is an act of military treason. You must have that audio broadcast loud enough for all Senate ears, so that all might possess the information. With anger in his demeanor but little choice in the matter, High Admiral Mirelio linked his communicator to the chamber speakers. The human vessel still rotating slowly above now cast an ominous shadow onto the assembly. Please reiterate what you were saying, Fleet Coordinator Brentis. He spoke into the outgoing communicator still keyed solely to his person. After a pause likely prompted by the unusual formality from the typically profanity-laced speech of the High Admiral, the fleet coordinator's voice echoed in the chambers. Well, as I was saying, even examining logs as far back as the initial human encounter, there has been no interception of translight communication towards human-controlled space. Mirelio inwardly groaned as the senators began to murmur. The communication interceptors were a classified military technology. Developed by Lenik military researchers, only the senators on the Military Budget Allocation Committee were aware of their existence. Now, they would become public knowledge. I took the initiative to scan radio signals for anything of human origin in case there were relay stations established outside the Senate border. None were detected. Again, High Admiral, the positive news is that there has been no active communication between humans within our controlled space. The negative news is that, if there truly are human stealth vessels inside our space, they either know or suspect our surveillance capabilities and have likely developed a countermeasure. I believe they have simply manually relayed information by flying in and out of our space. There was a pause, and fortunately, all individual conversations between senators were silenced, allowing Mirelio to contemplate. Brentis was an exceptionally intelligent commander, capable of remarkable lateral thinking and thorough planning. It was the reason he had been promoted so rapidly while still so young. He had swiftly deduced the potential issues and applied the knowledge so quickly it was as if he was planning, even while still in preparatory thought. It was a feat even Mirelio couldn't achieve. What about the heat signature scans? You received the data on the specifics, correct? Mirelio spoke as he glanced towards the physician again. Are the ships up there? The Senate fell silent immediately. There is a vast amount of space to cover, High Admiral, and the heat scanning technology is not optimal on most vessels. But yes, reports indicate there are random heat plumes in unexpected areas above several Senate core worlds, Brentis stated hesitantly. Morello felt nausea rise between his dual stomachs as apprehension enveloped his thoughts. All the senators remained silent, seemingly infected by the same fear. Brentis spoke once more. "Sir, if these signatures are indeed human ships, at least in this disaster, they are few. There aren't nearly enough to suggest an invasion force. I would conjecture their purpose is reconnaissance." Brentis. Morello disregarded the formal title. It was truly all he could manage to speak. "What of the Senate gathering planet? Is there a human vessel above L?" I believe so, sir. It was positioned right beneath the Steadfast Serenity. I can focus external views on it, High Admiral. Would you like a visual? Yes. Link it to my communicator." The old human ship vanished as the real-time image of the human stealth craft appeared above the Senate, a sleek object with a peculiar shape. O deities above, right beside the flagship of the Senate fleet. How much intelligence had the humans gathered? How much had they transmitted? If they could get so near to such a crucial vessel, what else had they observed? Suddenly, he was immensely relieved it wasn't his decision to fire, igniting a war with an enemy they understood so little about and who knew so much about them. Morello forced himself to remain calm. Rational thought was essential, and he couldn't succumb to the pervasive fear right now. Even if they had more reconnaissance, the humans still lacked the technology of the unified galactic Senate. Moreover, their numbers were insignificant compared to the myriad races represented in the Senate. Technology, numbers, and, the High Admiral reassured himself, millennia of space warfare experience. The sheer volume of military history a high officer must study to be promoted to command was astounding. None could plan or direct war to rival the leaders of the UGS military. Surely humanity could not with their mere centuries of space warfare. The issue was that humanity was expanding rapidly and warring throughout. They gained experience and people with each passing year. Their growth was far more concerning than their current strength. More confident, but not entirely free of that hesitant feeling, High Admiral Morello returned to the podium. "So you have heard what I have heard. You have seen the ships the humans have above us." The senators all seemed to hang on his words. Humanity looms above us, observing our worlds and expanding their own. Their people are unrestrained and their intentions deceitful. Morello's voice rose until it reverberated through the Senate chambers. "Already we have endured an attack by their renegades. Do we wait for a full assault by the USG itself? Or do we retaliate now? Do we fight back for what was done? Do we initiate what these repugnant spies indicate will come? Dare we start this war?" In the prolonged silence that followed, Lazinx raised one arm and uttered one word. "Aye." Swiftly following was an appendage of every representative in the room, even the eighth arm. Morello keyed his communicator. "Fleet Coordinator Brentis, have every ship in the fleet target one of the human stealth ships." "It is already done, High Admiral." High Admiral Morello took a final look at the stealth ship image floating above him, the sleek design and sharp points etched around the entire figure in ridges, giving it such an odd appearance. He keyed the communicator again and spoke a single word. "Fire!"
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.